What happens when the brittle arrogance of new money collides with the quiet resilience of old soul? In the heart of New York City, a 23-year-old art history student named Clara Mayhew, who pays her tuition by serving the city's elite, is about to discover the answer. For her, life is a carefully balanced ledger of expenses and exhausting hours. For Julian Vance, the 25-year-old heir to a tech and real estate empire, life is a frictionless reality, a playground built by his father's ambition where consequences are for other people. One cold Tuesday night, their worlds don't just collide, they shatter. The weapon of choice isn't a plate of pasta, but a glass of 1982 Chateau Margaux, used to inflict a humiliation so profound it stains more than just a uniform. But this isn't merely a story of a young woman's mistreatment. It's the story of what happened the next day when the architect of Julian's world, his formidable father, Alistair Vance, arrived at Clara's door. He didn't come bearing a simple apology. He came with the keys to the most coveted penthouse in the city, a historic landmark overlooking Central Park. The reason for this staggering gesture had little to do with charity and everything to do with a desperate high-stakes game of corporate warfare, a game in which Clara, unknowingly, was about to become the most valuable player. Julian Vance operated in a universe hermetically sealed from inconvenience. At 25, he was the only son of Alistair Vance, a man who had clawed his way from the grid of Queens to the gleaming apex of Manhattan's skyline, building Vance Holdings into a behemoth of disruptive technology and ruthless real estate acquisition. But Julian didn't see the architecture of the empire. He only saw the penthouse suites, the private jets, and the infinite credit line it afforded him. His existence was a meticulously curated stream of fleeting pleasures. Rooftop parties where the skyline was just a backdrop for a selfie, impromptu trips to St. Bart's, and a revolving court of acolytes whose laughter was as purchased as the champagne they drank. Tonight's stage for his casual theater of contempt was Aurelia, a restaurant so steeped in old-world opulence that its name was whispered like a password among the city's true power brokers. The ambiance was one of hushed reverence, mahogany-paneled walls, conversations muted by thick Persian rugs, and waiters who moved with the silent, spectral grace of seasoned butlers. Julian occupied the prime corner table, flanked by his two most loyal sycophants. Todd, a trust fund parasite whose primary skill was agreeing with Julian, and Brielle, a social media influencer whose worldview was filtered through the lens of her smartphone camera. "I mean, look at this place," Julian sneered, gesturing with a dismissive wave at the room's Gilded Age decor. "It's a museum. My father loves it, of course. He thinks anything that gathers dust is venerable." He swirled the deep garnet wine in his glass. "They recommended this. Tastes like an old library book. I'm building an app that will disrupt this entire industry. AI-driven wine pairings. No more listening to some fossil in a cheap suit tell you what to drink." "Totally, Jules," Todd chimed in, his grin vapid. "The future is now. These places are dinosaurs." Brielle, absorbed in crafting the perfect candid shot of her diamond bracelet against the crystal glass, added without looking up, "The lighting in here is, like, offensively yellow. No one looks good in yellow." Clara Mayhew heard every word as she approached the table, a heavy silver tray balanced expertly on one hand. She maintained a placid, professional mask, an expression of serene neutrality she had cultivated over 3 years of navigating the egos of the 1%. At 23, Clara wasn't serving blinis and caviar because she was passionate about hospitality. She was doing it because her grandmother, Eleanor, the woman who had raised her, was slowly being stolen by Parkinson's disease. Clara's world was a cramped, fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria, a world that smelled of her grandmother's lavender sachets and the faint, sharp scent of rubbing alcohol. It was a world of mounting bills for specialized care, physical therapy, and medications whose costs were a constant, crushing weight. Every dollar Clara earned, every rare and generous tip, was deposited into an account grimly nicknamed the Eleanor Fund. It was a dam holding back a flood, and the cracks were starting to show. She was a semester away from finishing her master's thesis on 18th century decorative arts, a passion that felt like a luxury from another lifetime. "Is the wine to your satisfaction this evening, sir?" Clara asked, her voice a model of professional decorum. Her eyes, however, instinctively noted the intricate rococo carvings on the antique credenza behind Julian's head, a detail of craftsmanship he was blind to. Julian didn't deign to look at her. He spoke to Todd. "She's asking if the fermented grape juice from before the internet was invented is to my satisfaction. What do you think, Todd?" Todd chuckled as if it were the wittiest remark he'd ever heard. "If you'd prefer something else, sir," Clara offered, her smile unwavering, "our sommelier would be happy to suggest a more modern vintage, perhaps a Screaming Eagle from Napa." Julian finally turned his eyes on her. They were a cold, pale blue, eyes that had never had to look at a price tag. "Oh, you have an opinion now? What, did you do a weekend course on wine?" "I've taken a few viticulture classes as part of my studies," Clara stated simply, refusing to be baited. It was a small, quiet truth. Her art history program included courses on the cultural artifacts of elite society, wine included. The admission was a mistake. It was a challenge. To Julian, she wasn't a student. She was staff. And the staff had just presumed to know something. "Your studies?" he repeated, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Let me guess. The University of Google? Tell me, in your studies, did they teach you about the first rule of your job? Which is that your opinion is irrelevant." Clara's jaw tightened. She could feel the ambient hum of the restaurant falter as nearby tables fell quiet. The humiliation was a prickling heat that crawled up her neck. She thought of Eleanor, of her trembling hands struggling to hold a fork, of the quiet dignity with which she faced her daily decline. That was real. This boy, this pampered princeling, was not. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice clipped. "I will inform the manager that you'd like the bottle removed from your bill." But Julian wasn't finished. He sought a climax, a story to amplify his own importance. He picked up his glass, the ruby liquid sloshing against the crystal. "Let me show you what I think of your studies," he said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he didn't just toss the wine. He deliberately, almost lazily, flung its contents directly at her. The dark red liquid arced through the air and splashed across the front of her crisp white blouse. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Several crimson drops spattered onto the delicate, silver filigree locket she wore around her neck. The last gift her grandmother had given her, the one thing she never took off. The silence that descended was thick and suffocating, broken only by Brielle's nervous titter. Clara stood frozen, the shock momentarily paralyzing her. The wine, cool and sticky, began to seep through the fabric onto her skin. She looked down at the ugly, jagged stain, a Rorschach test of privilege and cruelty, and then she looked back up at Julian's smug face. In that instant, the mask of the professional waitress didn't just crack, it vaporized. She didn't scream. She didn't burst into tears. Her voice, when it came, was low and trembling, with a fury so cold it was almost serene. She met his cold blue eyes, and for the first time, he saw something in them other than deference. He saw fire. "That locket you just stained," she said, her voice barely audible but carrying across the silent room, "was made in 1780 by a Parisian silversmith named Jean-Pierre Devine. It's not worth much money, but it has survived 2 centuries, a revolution, and 2 world wars. I'm sure it will survive you as well. You, on the other hand, are worth a great deal of money, but you possess nothing of any value." Without another word, she turned with military precision and walked away, leaving behind a stunned dining room, the faint, lingering scent of Bordeaux and bruised dignity, and a young billionaire who, for the first time in his life, had been rendered utterly speechless. She didn't see the restaurant manager, Monsieur Dubois, a man whose spine was merely a suggestion, scurrying to Julian's table, bowing and offering profuse apologies. She didn't hear Julian, recovering his swagger, laugh it off, and toss his black titanium credit card onto the table. "Just bill me for the dry cleaning," he'd said with a smirk, "and for her severance." Clara was already in the staff locker room, her hands shaking as she unclasped the locket. She wiped the wine from its surface with a desperate tenderness, the tears of rage finally, silently, tracing paths down her cheeks. The stain on her shirt was an inconvenience. The desecration of this small piece of her history felt like a violation of the soul. The walk of shame from Monsieur Dubois' office to the service exit felt miles long. The manager had been brutally efficient, his gaze fixed on a point just over her shoulder. "Clara, we have a standard of decorum," he'd said, his voice slick with false regret. "The Vance family are among our most esteemed patrons. You were insubordinate." "He threw an entire glass of wine on me," Clara stated, her voice flat with disbelief. "And your response escalated the situation," Dubois countered, his tone final. "We cannot have staff making scenes. It is best for all parties if we terminate your employment immediately. Here is your final paycheck." There was no severance. It was less than hush money, it was a dismissal. Clara knew arguing was futile. In the gilded ecosystem of Aurelia, the customer wasn't just king, they were a deity, and Julian Vance was the heir to their pantheon. She changed out of her stained uniform, folding it carefully and placing it in her bag as if it were evidence, and stepped out into the biting November air. The city lights, usually a source of comfort, seemed to mock her, glittering like 1,000 unblinking, indifferent eyes. The subway ride back to Queens was a blur of muffled announcements and the weary faces of other people heading home from their own battles. When she finally climbed the 4 flights of stairs and opened the door to her apartment, the familiar scent of her grandmother's rosewater potpourri filled her with a sense of both comfort and failure. Eleanor was asleep in her recliner, a worn afghan draped over her frail legs. Her breathing was soft, a quiet rhythm in the stillness of the room. Clara looked at her, at the fine, papery skin of her hands, and the weight of her new reality settled upon her. The Eleanor Fund had just lost its only source of income. She sat at the small kitchen table, the offending locket clutched in her hand, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a single, choked sob. Meanwhile, across the river in Manhattan, the incident was already being spun into a self-serving anecdote. Todd was regaling a group of friends at an after-hours club with a highly fictionalized account. And then this waitress, totally out of nowhere, starts lecturing Jules on art history or something. Can you believe the nerve? By morning, a sanitized version would appear on a gossip site, painting Julian as the victim of bizarrely aggressive service, a story he would read on his phone before his morning espresso and dismiss with a self-satisfied smirk. The girl, the locket, the cruelty, it was all just digital smoke, already dissipating into the ether of his consequence-free world. But an ember from that night was still glowing, and it was about to be fanned into a flame. A busboy at Aurelia, a quiet immigrant named Javier, who respected Clara for her kindness, had seen everything. He had said nothing, but his eyes had missed no detail. That night, he typed out a simple, factual email describing the event exactly as it had happened, and sent it not to a journalist, but to a private email address he had been given once for emergencies. The direct line to the head of security for Vance Holdings. The insignificant waitress was about to land on the radar of a man who missed nothing. Alistair Vance had not built his empire by being oblivious. At 65, he was a man forged from pressure and discipline, his calm demeanor a thin crust over a molten core of ambition. His office, occupying the entire top floor of the Vance Tower, was a monument to controlled power. It was not a space of mahogany and leather, but of cold steel, polished concrete, and floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a god's-eye view of the city he had conquered. From this perch, he tracked global markets, political tides, and technological currents with the same predatory focus. He also tracked his son. He loved Julian, but it was a love frayed by a profound and corrosive disappointment. He saw the bright, inquisitive boy he'd raised slowly curdle into a vapid caricature of inherited wealth. Alistair had given Julian every advantage, but in doing so, he feared he had deprived him of the one element that had shaped his own character: adversity. Alistair's own story was a testament to grit. The son of a tugboat captain who'd built his fortune on one brilliant, high-risk tech patent and decades of 70-hour work weeks. He'd hoped that ethos would be inherited like his blue eyes, but it had proven to be a recessive trait. Alistair didn't learn about the incident at Aurelia from a gossip column. He learned of it at 6 a.m. via a single encrypted message on his personal tablet from Marcus Thorne, his head of security. Marcus was a former MI6 operative whose loyalty Alistair had bought 15 years ago, and his job was less about protecting the Vances from kidnappers and more about protecting the Vance name from Julian. The message was terse, containing Javier the busboy's verbatim account. "Sir, an incident involving Julian at Aurelia last night. A waitress, Clara Mayhew, was terminated following a confrontation. The attached is a staff witness account. The matter appears contained, but the details are unseemly." Alistair read the unvarnished report, the condescending remarks, the flaunting of ignorance as a virtue, and the final vulgar act of flinging wine on a young woman. Then he read her response, the part about the locket. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through him. He tapped a command on his screen. Within 5 minutes, a full background file on Clara Mayhew, compiled by Marcus's efficient team, appeared. He saw her grades from Columbia University, stellar. Her major, art history and material culture. He read about her grandmother, Eleanor Mayhew, the Parkinson's diagnosis, the financial strain evident in a search of public records. He saw a note about the Eleanor Fund. The detail was so specific, so poignant, it felt like a punch to the gut. Alistair leaned back in his chair, the rising sun setting the city ablaze in hues of orange and pink. He felt no anger. Anger was an inefficient emotion. What he felt was a cold, clarifying resolve. He had been too passive, hoping Julian would somehow stumble into maturity. He had been wrong. His son was not just adrift. He was becoming a liability, a moral black hole shielded by the very fortune Alistair had built. The time for hope was over. The time for a controlled demolition and reconstruction had arrived. He saw the file on a recent acquisition. The Alcott, a pre-war residential building on Central Park West, a historic landmark that Vance Holdings was painstakingly restoring. The crown jewel was the Penthouse, a magnificent duplex that had been under renovation for 2 years. He had intended it as a gift for Julian's 30th birthday, another gilded cage. A new, far more audacious plan began to form in his mind, a plan of profound, poetic justice. He activated his intercom. "Marcus, get me everything you can on Monsieur Dubois at Aurelia. I want to know about his debts, his vices, his aspirations, everything. And I want the ownership records for the building the restaurant leases. If it's for sale, buy it. If it's not, make an offer they can't refuse. I want to be their landlord by noon." "Consider it done, sir." "One more thing, Marcus," Alistair added, his voice hardening. "Get me the keys to the Alcott penthouse and have a deed drawn up. The new owner is Clara Mayhew." A full 3 seconds of silence passed on the other end of the line, the longest Marcus had ever been quiet in Alistair's memory. "Sir?" "You heard me," Alistair said, "and cancel all of Julian's credit cards. Freeze his personal accounts, effective immediately. I want him to have nothing but the cash in his wallet. Then tell him I want to see him at the estate tonight. It's time for his performance review." That evening, the confrontation took place in Alistair's private library at the family's Westchester estate. The room was the one concession to his past, filled with books on history, engineering, and the biographies of great men. It was where he did his real thinking. Julian swaggered in, still buzzing from the retelling of his victory over the uppity waitress. "You wanted to see me, Dad? If this is about the spend on the Amex last month, the market was up." "Sit down, Julian." Alistair's voice was quiet, but it had the density of a collapsing star. Julian sat. "I received a report this morning about your dinner last night," Alistair began, his face impassive. "Tell me what happened." Julian immediately launched into the curated narrative. It was nothing. The service was a joke. This waitress had a massive chip on her shoulder, started getting aggressive. Dubois handled it. She was unprofessional. Alistair let the silence hang in the air, a palpable weight between them. "That's not what I heard," he said finally. "I heard you berated a young woman who was doing her job, and when she demonstrated more intelligence than you assaulted her." "Assaulted her? I spilled some wine." "For God's sake, Dad. She was being insubordinate. I was defending our name." People expect a certain standard from a Vance. Alistair let out a dry, mirthless laugh. Our name? You think you honor the Vance name by behaving like a decadent Roman emperor, humiliating people for sport? That name was built on calloused hands and sleepless nights, not on your capacity for cruelty. You are a parasite, Julian, living off a body you did nothing to build. The words struck Julian with physical force. That's not fair. You have no idea. I have every idea. Alistair's voice boomed, the controlled facade cracking. The young woman you got fired? Her name is Clara Mayhew. She's a graduate student at Columbia, top of her class. She was working that job, serving spoiled children like you, to pay for her grandmother's medical care. A woman who is fighting a degenerative neurological disease. Alistair stood and walked to the window, his back to his son. You didn't just throw wine on a waitress, Julian. You took a wrecking ball to the only thing holding that family together, for a moment of cheap amusement. You are my greatest failure. Julian was stunned, speechless. The depth of his father's knowledge was terrifying. Get out, Alistair said, his voice now a deadly whisper. Go back to your apartment. A car will pick you up in the morning for a new assignment. Your allowance, your cards, your access to all funds are terminated. You are now an employee, and you are about to learn the meaning of the word value. Humiliated and shaken, Julian left the library, the world tilting on its axis. For the first time, he felt the icy chill of a world without a safety net. The next morning, Clara was staring at a sheaf of overdue bills when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed on her apartment door. She opened it to find a man who looked like he had stepped out of the pages of Forbes magazine. He was older, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his gray hair impeccably styled. His eyes, the same cold blue as his son's, held a formidable intelligence. "Miss Mayhew?" he asked. His voice was calm, but it held an undeniable power. "My name is Alistair Vance. I am Julian's father. May I have a moment of your time?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified but also furious. She blocked the doorway, her small frame rigid with defiance. "If you're here to offer me money to keep quiet, you can save your breath. I'm not interested." Alistair's expression didn't change, but he seemed to give a subtle nod of approval. "On the contrary, Miss Mayhew, your voice is precisely what I'm here to invest in. I am not here to apologize for my son. An apology is a word. It's meaningless. I am here to offer a proposition." He held out a slim, elegant leather folio. Confused, Clara took it. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was not a check, but a single ornate brass key and a platinum key card. "What is this?" she whispered, her suspicion warring with her curiosity. "That is the key to the penthouse at the Alcott on Central Park West," Alistair said, as if discussing the weather. "The deed has been transferred to your name. It is, legally and irrevocably, your property. It comes with a staff and a stipend for maintenance. It is yours." Clara stared at him, convinced she was hallucinating or that this was the prelude to some unspeakably cruel joke. "Why? Why would you do this?" "Because," Alistair said, his eyes locking onto hers, "my company is in the final stages of a hostile takeover of a major competitor, a French luxury conglomerate run by a man named Antoine Dubois. He is an eccentric, a historian, a man who values provenance and legacy above all else. My board, my executives, they are tech guys, finance sharks. They don't speak his language. They are failing to win his confidence." He paused, letting the information sink in. "I read your academic file, Miss Mayhew. Your thesis is on the very period of decorative arts that Dubois is a world-renowned expert on. This penthouse, the Alcott, is one of the finest examples of that period's architecture in this city. It is a landmark I personally saved from demolition." The pieces of a bewildering puzzle began to click into place. "You want me to help you talk to him?" "I want to hire you," Alistair corrected, "as a consultant for Vance Holdings. Your new home will be your office. Your first project is to advise me on the Dubois acquisition. You will be paid a salary of $500,000 a year, with full medical and dental coverage for you and your grandmother, effective immediately. We will arrange for the best in-home care for her starting today." Clara felt the floor sway beneath her. It was too much, too fast. the solution to every single one of her prayers, delivered by the father of the boy who had caused her ruin. There had to be a catch. "And your son?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. A flicker of something grim and satisfying appeared in Alistair's eyes. "My son's education begins today. He has been stripped of all wealth and privilege. His new job is in the wash." The silence of the penthouse was the first thing that truly terrified her. It was a profound, geological silence, a quiet so absolute it felt like a pressure against her eardrums. In her Astoria walk-up, sound had been a constant companion. The groan of the building's pipes, the murmur of her grandmother's television, the distant wail of a siren weaving itself into the fabric of the night. Here, on the 68th floor of the Alcott, the city was a silent, glittering film spread out beneath her feet. The silence was the sound of power, a vacuum where the petty noises of survival could not exist. And in her first week, Clara Mayhew felt like she was suffocating in it. Her first act was not one of command, but of love. She oversaw every detail of Eleanor's transition, not with the detached efficiency of a new executive, but with the frantic, tender precision of a granddaughter. She interviewed nurses, vetted physical therapists, and personally selected the sunniest room for Eleanor, one whose vast window overlooked the reservoir, a placid blue eye in the green expanse of the park. When Eleanor finally settled into a plush armchair, her frail hands steady in her lap, a look of peaceful wonder on her face, Clara felt the first real anchor in her new, vertiginous reality. The guilt of accepting this impossible gift receded, replaced by a crystalline resolve. This was not a bribe. It was a battlefield, and she had just secured her reason for fighting. Her second act was to draft Julian's first assignment. She sat at a massive 18th century mahogany desk, a genuine Röntgen, she'd noted with a historian's thrill, and considered the nature of cruelty. She could be punitive. She could assign him something physically grueling or deeply humiliating. But her fury had cooled from a raging fire to a focused, blue-hot flame. Cruelty was his language, not hers. Her weapon would be tedium. Her revenge would be the meticulous, soul-crushing weight of history itself. She chose a collection of uncatalogued municipal ledgers from the 1930s, thousands of pages of property transfers from a defunct real estate firm Vance Holdings had absorbed decades ago. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. The task required immense concentration and offered zero intellectual reward. It was the academic equivalent of being sentenced to count grains of sand. She typed the instructions in a cool, impersonal email and sent it to an address she'd been given. jvance.employee to foreign to Vance Holdings, internal. She then forwarded a copy to Alistair Vance, a silent checkmate. Julian's response was a digital scream. A tempest of emails, each more vitriolic than the last, flooded her inbox. They were filled with threats, insults, and the wounded bellowing of a prince locked in a dungeon. "Who the hell do you think you are? You're a waitress. My father will hear about this. This is harassment." Clara read each one, her expression unchanging. She didn't reply. She simply created a folder labeled JV Correspondence and methodically dragged each message into it, an archivist cataloging the death throes of an obsolete creature. After 3 days, the email stopped. A curt notification from the head archivist, a stern woman named Miss Albright, informed her that Mr. Vance had begun his work. While Julian was entombed in the sub-basement, Clara ascended. She worked with a ferocity born of terror and gratitude. She consumed every document related to Antoine Dubois, not just his company's financials, but his personal history, his published articles on Napoleonic-era furniture, his philanthropic passions. She discovered he was a man haunted by the concept of terroir, the idea that an object, like a wine, draws its value from the soil and soul of its origin. The Vance Holdings executives, with their talk of synergy and leveraged buyouts, were speaking a language he fundamentally despised. They wanted to buy his assets. Clara realized the only way to succeed was to acquire his legacy. She built her presentation for Alistair not on spreadsheets but on stories. She connected the craftsmanship of Dubois' luxury brands to the architectural integrity of the landmarks Vance Holdings was restoring. She framed the acquisition not as a conquest but as a curatorship. Alistair listened, his pale blue eyes betraying nothing, but his questions grew sharper, more engaged. The other executives in the boardroom watched her with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They saw the waitress consultant speaking a language of art and history they couldn't comprehend, yet they saw it swaying the one man who mattered. Clara learned to navigate their silent condescension, her quiet confidence a shield forged in the fires of Aurelia. She was no longer performing deference, she was commanding respect. After a month of silence, Alistair summoned her. His office was a minimalist expanse of steel and glass, a stark contrast to the historical richness of her penthouse. "He is compliant," Alistair said, his voice flat. "Ms. Albright reports his work is adequate, but he is not learning, he is enduring. A caged animal learns nothing of the world. It only learns the dimensions of its cage." He paused, his gaze fixed on the urban tapestry below. "The final meeting with Dubois is in 2 weeks, at his family estate in the Loire Valley. You will lead the cultural presentation, and Julian will accompany you." A cold dread washed over Clara. "As what?" "As your assistant," Alistair said, a flicker of something glacial in his eyes. "He will carry your briefcase. He will arrange your transportation. He will stand behind you while you speak. The humiliation is not the point. The proximity is. He needs to witness the source of the power that has displaced him. He needs to see that value is not something you inherit, but something you create, viscerally." The flight to France was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. The three of them sat in the hushed, cream-leather cabin of the Vance jet, a trinity of silent tension. Alistair read financial reports, Clara reviewed her notes, and Julian stared out the window, his entire body a knot of resentment. He had lost weight, the soft edges of indulgence planed away, revealing the sharp, unhappy bones of his face. He performed his duties with a brittle robotic correctness, arranging the car, handling the luggage, never once meeting her eyes. He was a ghost haunting his own former life. The Château de Valois-Rochefort was not a house, it was a testament. It rose from the morning mist like a dream of the 17th century, its limestone walls glowing in the soft French light. Antoine Dubois was the chateau personified, elegant, ancient, and fortified against the vulgarities of the modern world. He greeted Clara with a courtly bow and a piercing, intelligent gaze, his eyes lingering for a moment on the simple silver locket at her throat. He barely acknowledged Julian. The initial meetings were a disaster. Alistair's team, despite his warnings, led with numbers and projections. They spoke of market share and brand integration. Dubois listened with a polite, weary boredom, his fingers drumming on the polished surface of a centuries-old table. He looked, Clara thought, like a king entertaining the petitions of well-dressed barbarians. The final night, a formal dinner was held in a gallery, hung with Dubois' ancestors. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and history. Dubois, clearly intending to deliver a final, gentle coup de grace to the deal, gestured with his wineglass to a portrait dominating the far wall. It depicted a severe-looking woman in a dark blue gown, her expression one of melancholy pride. "My great-great-great-grandmother, the Comtesse de Valois," Dubois said, his voice resonating in the cavernous room. "A woman of her time. She possessed everything, and the revolution took it all. A tragic story. It reminds one that all empires, corporate or otherwise, eventually crumble into dust." The remark was aimed squarely at Alistair. It was then that Julian, silent for 2 days, finally broke. Perhaps it was the wine or the cumulative humiliation or the sight of Clara being treated as an intellectual peer. He saw an opening, a chance to reclaim a piece of his old self, the cynical, dismissive tech bro. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure contempt. "Tragic, I guess," and he said, the words slurring slightly, "or just inevitable. You can't cling to the past. You either disrupt or you get disrupted. Creative destruction. It's the engine of progress." A silence so cold it seemed to suck the warmth from the candle flames fell over the table. Alistair's face became a mask of cold fury. He looked as if he was about to physically eject his son from the room, but Clara felt a strange calm descend. This was it, the moment the entire insane exercise had been leading toward. She didn't look at Julian. She looked at the painting, and then she turned her full, undivided attention to Antoine Dubois. "Forgive me, monsieur," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. "But I do not believe her story is tragic in the least. I believe she is a symbol of profound resilience." Dubois leaned forward, his boredom evaporating, replaced by a hawk-like curiosity. "Explain, mademoiselle." Clara's heart was hammering, but her mind was a library, every card falling perfectly into place. That portrait was painted by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun in the spring of 1788. And your ancestor was not born a comtesse. She was the daughter of a merchant from Lyon. She married into the title. Her brilliance, not her bloodline, gave her that life. And when the revolution came and she lost her husband and her lands, she did not perish. The historical record is quite clear. She fled to America with her children and a handful of jewels. She sold one of them, a silver locket, according to her journals, to buy a tract of sugarcane land in Louisiana. Her family didn't just survive. They founded a new dynasty in a new world, built not on a crumbling aristocratic title, but on courage and foresight. She paused, then finally, deliberately, turned her gaze on Julian. The contempt in his eyes had been replaced by a dawning, horrified shock. "That," she said, her voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity, "is the true meaning of creative destruction. It is not about mindlessly tearing things down because they are old. It is about having the wisdom to find what is truly valuable amidst the wreckage and the courage to build something new from it." The room was utterly still. Julian stared at her, and in his eyes she saw the entire architecture of his world collapse. He wasn't seeing the waitress he'd humiliated. He wasn't seeing the supervisor who tormented him. He was seeing a woman who wielded knowledge like a weapon, who had taken the pieces of her own humiliation, the locket, the insult, and forged them into an unassailable argument. He saw for the first time what real power looked like. Antoine Dubois let the silence stretch. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. He raised his glass, not to Alistair, but to Clara. "Mademoiselle Mayhew," he roared with delight, "you have not just studied history, you have inhaled it. You understand its soul." He turned to Alistair, his eyes glittering. "Vance, your strategies are aggressive and your financials are impeccable, but they are worthless without a soul. Your consultant, she is the soul. Let us speak of a true partnership, one that honors the past as we build the future." The deal was done. On the flight home, the silence had a different texture. It was not hostile, but heavy, saturated with unspoken admissions. As the lights of New York spread beneath them, a glittering net cast across the darkness, Julian finally spoke. His voice was raw, unused. How did you know that? About her? About the locket?" Clara didn't look up from the book she was pretending to read. "It's my job to know the provenance of things," she said quietly. He was silent for a long time. The jet's engines whined as it began its final descent. "The locket," he said, the words barely a whisper. "The one at the restaurant. He couldn't say the word. "Sorry." It was a foreign currency for which he had no frame of reference. Clara closed her book and finally looked at him. Her eyes were not angry, not triumphant. They were just weary. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was an epitaph for the boy he had been. Julian did not undergo a magical transformation. There was no single moment of redemption. Instead, there was a long, slow, painful dismantling. He returned to the sub-basement, but the archives no longer felt like a prison. They felt like a truth. He stopped seeing the documents as a punishment and began to see them for what they were: the fossil record of human ambition, failure, and resilience. He found the original charter for Vance Holdings, a flimsy, coffee-stained document signed by his grandfather, a man he'd only known as a gruff old man who smelled of salt and oil. He read logbooks from his grandfather's tugboat, filled with entries about engine trouble, treacherous currents, and the quiet pride of making it back to harbor. He found his great-grandmother's immigration papers from County Cork, her occupation listed as seamstress. He discovered that the Vance name, the name he had wielded like a scepter, was not rooted in boardrooms and penthouses, but in engine grease, needle-prick fingers, and the raw, desperate grit of survival. He was the descendant of people who built things, and he had spent his life breaking them. Clara, now a senior vice president and Alistair's most trusted advisor, used her power to create. She spearheaded the establishment of the Vance Foundation for Historic and Cultural Preservation, using Alistair's capital and her own encyclopedic knowledge to rescue architectural treasures from the wrecking ball. The penthouse was no longer a silent, terrifying cage. It was her command center, a place where she could see the entire city and plot how to save its soul, one building at a time. She moved Eleanor to a specialized care facility in Scottsdale, where the dry desert air eased the tremors in her limbs. She flew to visit her every month, walking with her through cactus gardens, the two of them talking for hours about art, history, and the strange, unpredictable currents of life. Those visits were her own personal terroir, the soil that kept her grounded. Almost exactly 1 year after the night at Aurelia, a thick, bound proposal landed on her desk. It was from Julian. It was a plan to fully digitize the Vance archives. But it was more than that. It was a vision to create a public-facing museum, the Vance Museum of New York Commerce, to tell the story of the city's working history through the documents he had spent a year preserving. It was meticulously researched, brilliantly argued, and deeply, achingly human. It included plans for educational outreach, partnerships with public schools, and a fellowship for immigrant history students. It was the first truly valuable thing he had ever created. Clara read it twice, her fingers tracing the title page. Then she picked up the phone and dialed the 4-digit extension for the sub-basement archives. He answered on the first ring. Vance. His voice was different, quieter, deeper. Julian, it's Clara Mayhew. The formality was a shield for them both. I've read your proposal. It's excellent. The vision is strong. But you've neglected to include a 5-year budget projection for archival conservation specialists and climate control maintenance. I need a revised draft on my desk by end of business tomorrow. We'll present it to your father together on Friday. She heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. A pause, then a single steady word. Understood. Clara hung up the phone. She rose from her desk and walked to the vast window, looking down at the endless river of headlights flowing through the canyons of the city. A new dynamic had been set, forged in humiliation and tempered by a year of painful reconstruction. It was not friendship. It was certainly not love. It was a hard-won, asymmetrical respect between two people who had seen the worst of each other. The waitress had not been rescued by the prince. She had dismantled his kingdom and built an empire of her own in its place. And the prince, exiled in the dust and darkness of his family's past, had finally, painstakingly, begun to learn how to build something real.